All right, welcome to the show. My name is Brett, and we're here to talk about all things DevOps, Docker, containers, Kubernetes, CI/CD, server management, cloud, you name it. We're talking about it as long as it's running or doing something with a container. And today, this is sort of a unique episode where I don't have a guest. I don't have a lot of news. This is all focused on your questions and us diving into some deep topics, maybe questions I couldn't have answered in previous shows because they were maybe too complicated. We can spend some time on that depending on how many of you are asking good questions. We can go to the command line if we want to. We can actually sort of get some work done today because I have nothing scheduled. There was a whole lot of stuff that I could have talked about, but you probably read the internet and you probably know most of this stuff anyway. So there's no reason for me to reiterate what is already in other, DevOps talks or news on Hacker News or Reddit or anything like that. So I do that most days. If this is new for you, if you've not been to my show before, normally we talk about news, we talk about what I'm doing this week, which we'll talk about that in a second because I'm at a conference. And let's see, what else? Oh, and we have guests and stuff like that. But I cleared the schedule for this week kind of by accident, but why not? Let's just get straight to it. Let's help people solve problems. And that's what I love to do here on YouTube is have fun, learn from you, hopefully learn something from me, and we work on stuff together. So this week, I'm actually at RevolutionConf, which is in my hometown. And it's our local community-run developer event. And these are my favorite kind of events. So, we all have different types of events. We have meetups. We have vendor events like DockerCon or Kubernetes conferences or AWS's reInvent. Those are all what I would consider vendor events, right? And they're focused on a particular product, usually sponsored by a single company with some small sponsors that help them out. And this one, though, RevolutionConf, is an entirely nonprofit-run community conference, which means no one gets paid to be there. Even the person who's in charge of it all doesn't make money on it. It's all volunteer time. And it's great because you get a different vibe, you get a different experience, you get, quite honestly, quirky talks, like cool, interesting talks that you would not see at a big conference, things that are maybe not so mainstream, or they're not pushing a particular product because they're just people tinkering around with technology. So I'm talking tomorrow, and let's look at the schedule real quick. Let's make sure that I'm going to be there. So tomorrow on Friday, I'm doing in the morning, I'm doing a Kubernetes and or Swarm container orchestration, deploy both and decide. So this will be the first time I'm doing this, but essentially I get about 3 hours to take people who have maybe not done any orchestration or who have little understanding of it, and hopefully they know a little bit about containers, and have them deploy a multi-tier distributed app on Swarm, then tear it all down, build up a Kubernetes cluster, and deploy the same thing. And then we compare and contrast and talk about things. So hopefully that'll work. I'm doing this also again in the fall. If you happen to live somewhere in Eastern Europe or Western Europe, let's see, GoToConf. Let's find that. No. So at GoToConf Berlin in October, I will be there doing a full day version of this workshop where I cram 2 orchestrators traditionally, which would take their own days and their own dedicated workshop, and I shove them into one, and we focus on the common principles of orchestration as well as the differences between the top 2 orchestrators. So I think it's going to be great, and hopefully people will get a good sense of the pros and cons of both, why they might want to choose one over the other, and they get their hands a little bit on each one, and hopefully they go to container orchestration. Like, that's kind of the purpose, is to figure out if you even need it, and if you need it, which one do you want to use. So I will be there. Check that conference out. Of course, if you need coupons to any of these things, hit me up on Twitter. That's at Brett Fisher on Twitter. And you can get, just ask me there in public or in a DM, and I can get you a coupon for that. All right, back to some of the stuff that's going on with me here. Sort of in the past is DockerCon's videos are all up on their website as well as YouTube from DockerCon. And so if you have not been here in the last couple of weeks, I had a talk there on, well, it's one of the 5 talks I did. I don't know why I volunteer for so many things. I did a talk on Docker for Node.js. So it was a sort of crammed session of essentially 40 minutes of what my new course is all about. And I take some of the biggest and best parts of that course of 9 hours of video, and I crammed it into 40 minutes. So it goes pretty fast, but you can now, on my website at brettfisher.com/docker, that little URL up there, you can get the code samples, the slides, as well as now watch the video. And those videos will actually be coming to my courses soon, because a lot of people don't necessarily watch this show. So if you're in my courses, the relevant parts of different DockerCon videos will be showing up in my courses that I'm doing on stage. Sometimes I spend months preparing those videos, and it kind of occurred to me that that would be very useful to someone taking my courses. So that stuff will be there. All right, so that is it for me. Of course, you can always get all my courses as well as all the other stuff, including my podcast and other resources, all at brettfisher.com/docker. And I keep adding more and more stuff there slowly over time. I try to put the bold stuff and the new things at the top. And I also send this stuff out on my newsletter, which you can also get on this page. So that newsletter probably goes out about once a month. It's not a weekly fill your inbox newsletter. It's really about things that I'm doing or things that I'm working on or teams that I'm working with or things that I like or discovered. And I leave sort of the latest news and all that sort of general stuff to all the other websites and newsletters that already do that are great to follow. So yeah, check that out. There's of course, you can find me on all of the social things. But down here, there's something else that most people don't realize until I mention it to them. I have an Ask Me Anything. So yes, you could ask me questions on this show. But if you're wanting to ask me a general question, not necessarily a troubleshooting question, but a general question, sort of an advice kind of question, I have an Ask Me Anything on GitHub. And I got this idea. Actually, I've cloned this repo from someone else. And essentially, we just use the GitHub issues to ask common questions, things like, how do I become a DevOps person if I'm already a developer or a sysadmin? Swarm versus Kubernetes conversations. What security concerns do I have when I deploy Docker? Sort of the common top questions that people ask me in the courses. I often say, hey, can you go to GitHub, ask me those questions in public so everybody else can learn from the discussion that we're going to have around that. And I collect all those here. And I have labels for them so you can filter by labels depending on what your orchestrator is or what topic is. Monitoring, for example, persistent data, security. So we don't have a ton yet. We're up to 63 questions. So please, if you have great questions here and you want to also discuss it with the community, because there are plenty of people now that are watching this. Oh, only 20. So, but hopefully we can get more people watching the questions here. Obviously, there's tons of places on the internet, but you know me, I focus on Docker. Like, that's my thing. So I help people with Docker all day. I talk about Docker all week. So hopefully, if the questions are specifically related to containers and the Docker tooling in particular, I will be able to find the best answers for you, at least the best answers that I know of. And that's it. All right, let's jump to your questions. I'm going to go back to the full screen here. And I'm going to scroll up. I'll basically work my way down from the top and see what we got today. Hello, everyone. Alexandra, everybody that's saying hi in the chat. Let's see. Let's do this question first. All right. Nuno's asking, I need my Docker file command to start a Cassandra server, and after that, I need to import a database schema. What is the best way to do that? So if someone hasn't already answered you in chat, because sometimes that happens while I'm rambling on, the entry point script is sort of the universal way to do things on container startup. So this means that you have inside your Docker file, you have the entry point and you have the CMD. Now, in my course, Docker Mastery, I focus on the CMD because that's really the thing that you need to understand at the beginning. What I need to add is a section, at least one lecture, on the entry point and discussing the various ways that you can do entry points. So an entry point, when we break it down, the entry point and the CMD are really two parts of the same single line or single command that Docker runs when your container starts. But the trick is with the magic of bash scripting, you can take the entry point and instead of it just being the beginning of the command that might be on the, in front of the CMD, it can run a script, and then at the end of that script, you can tell it to pass execution to the rest of the command line. So it may not make a whole lot of sense, but let's go check a real world one out and see what we can see. So I'm going to pull up MySQL, because really any persistent data storage system is going to act the same way here. And if I look up on Docker Hub, all right. So I'm at the Docker Hub MySQL official image. And if I click on any one of these releases at the top, I will get the Docker file, which is open source. And in this file, you'll find lots of things. You know, obviously it's installing MySQL and getting SQL properly configured. But down here at the bottom, you'll notice a couple of things. One is it's copying a shell script into a certain location, and it's running a symlink there, but that's just really for backwards compatibility. But down here, this is the key part. The entry point script, which the entry point itself, the command in the Docker file, doesn't have to be a script. Again, it's really just taking, if it exists, the entry point and the CMD, and it's just putting them together and running them all in one line. So you would see the two common ways that entry point is used is either for the beginning of a command, that maybe if you're using Docker to run a command line utility. I do this in HTTP ping. Let's see if I can... So I have a Docker image rather, and a GitHub repo behind it. And what it's doing is it's running a single command line utility in a container. And the way that it works here is I have the entry point being the command itself. And then since the CMD goes after that, when I have both of them in my Docker file and it just swishes them together, I have it running the default CMD. So if you think about it, when I run this command from the command line, I can do docker run Brett Fisher / HTTP ping, and then I just hit enter, and then it will automatically run the version command. But if I keep typing in that command line, right, docker run Brett Fisher, if I just do that, it's going to pull the image. Oops, sorry, let me switch screens on you. So if I run this image, it's going to run it by default, and it basically dumps out the help because that's what the Docker file told it to do in the CMD line. But if I just change something on the end, because remember the format of a Docker run command is that it will do Docker run, and then do your options, then do the image you're going to set, or you're going to run, and then anything after that replaces the CMD in line. So it's like a dynamic replacement of the CMD. So if I just run here, google.com, it will replace the -- version that it would run by default. So this is a really cool way that you can use Docker run as a command line utility, and that's my example essentially of how to do that. Now, the other way to do it is not that. That's the one way to do it. The other way is a shell script. So we'll see here the entry point here is defining the file that it should run. And then if I just scroll all the way to the top here and I do this 8.0 directory, I sort of go up one directory, I'll actually find that there's another file there. That's the Docker entry point script that it's copying in on the build. Now, in this script, what's going on? There's tons of stuff in here, probably at least 100 lines. Yep, in fact, it's hundreds of lines. But the magic part here is this. Let me zoom out. Okay. Go away, scroll bar. I don't want to see you. Let's just go to raw. That very bottom line there, that exec and then the $@ that tells the shell, hey, I'm ending this script. Please pass the execution to the rest of my command line, which would be whatever's in the CMD. And in this case, it was the MySQL daemon. So essentially what's going to happen when the container starts up in this case is it will run the script. It gets to the end of the script. The exec says, please do whatever else I told you at the end of this command. And that runs your daemon, your MySQL daemon in the foreground so that it stays running. Now, what the script does is all the things you probably didn't realize were happening in the background when you started a database container. It creates the default user that you want to set. It changes the root password to whatever you want it to set. It creates the database based on what you told it, and it's doing all that in environment variables, right? Because if we backed up to, let me just duplicate this, and if we backed up to the library, you know, on most of these official images, you're going to have a whole bunch of environment variables, and it specifies them all down here. And all those environment variables are used in that script to pre-configure MySQL. Now, in the file itself, if you were actually to dive into it, it is setting some environment variables and finding files in case you're using Docker Swarm secrets, stuff like that. And then it's basically getting all the data it needs to configure it. Then it starts up MySQL, configures it, including changing the root password and all the other things. Then it shuts down MySQL and then ends the script and then passes that execution to MySQL to start up again, but this time for good. So it's essentially starting SQL, doing some things, stopping SQL, starting it back up. And that's the way that all these work, all these persistent storage systems inside of the official containers work. So for you, the long answer to this question is that you're going to want to use your own custom entry point script. Maybe you copy the default one, if there is one, or maybe you make your own. And then you would make your own image that would then create that schema initially on the first startup. Now, once you have your schema inside the database, you're not going to really want to update schemas that way. You would want to do further schemas through some other utility outside of that container, right? You would run your MySQL commands from another container, and then they would run over the network, something like that. Now, you don't have to change this at all. You could simply have it start up your Cassandra and then add the schema from a different container, but you would have to control that order, right? You would have to wait for Cassandra to start up. You would have to have another container that maybe has its own script, and then that script maybe is smart enough to keep checking for Cassandra to see if it's ready, and then when it's ready, then run your schema, either schema update or your original schema installation, essentially. You could do it that way, and that, in a lot of cases, is probably the right way to do it. But especially when you're doing local development, or you just want to spin up something small and easy, and you just wanted to build a schema the first time, and you wanted to do it automatically, then what you would do here is you would use the official default image, and you would add your own schema and file to that in your own custom image, and essentially, when it started up the first time, it would do that. Now, here's the problem, and you got to watch out for this. This entry point script runs every time the container starts, at least from that image, right? From that image that you had built, the custom one. So you want to make sure that your script is smart enough that it doesn't rerun the schema over and over again on a database that already has the schema. So you have to build in that intelligence, and that's why sometimes, depending on your model, if you're thinking of updating things regularly, or if you're constantly moving databases around in a Swarm cluster or a Kubernetes cluster, then doing it inside the database container itself may not be the right strategy for you. But this option exists, so check it out. And that is like the Cliff Notes on what to do with entry points, which was not in my original course. So I could probably just add this video in there and at least have supplemental material for now. That's probably better than having nothing. All right, let's go back to the questions. That's a great question to start off with. I'm glad we dove into that one. So Alexandra says, Docker run net. How does it work? No info in Docker help. Let's go check that out. So this is what I would do. So I'm on a Mac. If you're on Windows, you may not have the grep command, but I would do something like docker run help grep net, just to find anything in the help, any sort of options that would have the word net in them. So net is a sort of shortcut to network or network alias, which would actually not work. It would probably be the network one. So in other words, if I do docker run net help, I'm not sure if this is what you're trying to run. Yeah, it's not going to work on that because I don't think that docker run has context-sensitive help on options, but I could be wrong. Yeah, so you're basically going to have to just filter out the you're going to have to filter out the something like grep, or if you're on Windows and you have PowerShell or something like that, you'll have to Google for the alternative solution over there for using that to find, or just using Command F whenever you print something out in the command line, depending on the tool you're using, and find that out. So hopefully that helps. It's short for the network command or the network option rather, and that just defines the network that your container will run in. And you can look at the list of containers, right, with docker network ls. So if I did a docker run net host, I could just type network if I wanted to as well, and then nginx, something like that. And then it's running on a different network, right? Now, if I made a custom network, then it could use that one, and that should answer your question. All right. Casey says, is this a place to ask about proxy and Artifactory? You can ask about it, but I'm not going to have any answers for that. Yeah, let's see. Hello from Berlin. Hello. All right. So question here, using Docker for Windows to develop a node project, Randomly, the container ghosts. I'll be in the container doing command line, and suddenly all directories are gone. Even ls fails. Thoughts? Um. This sounds like it might not be. I'm going to guess. I have not seen this issue, but I'm going to guess that it's not a Docker issue, and it's maybe a shell issue. In other words, so hopefully what you're doing is you're doing an exec command, right? So you've started the container in the background, and then you're execing in. And if even an ls command fails, and the container is still running, which I would assume it is, if it's a web app, then if you can validate that the container is still running in a different shell window, or if you can get in a different shell window and then exec back into that container through a different process. Because when you exec into a running container, it's technically running as a different process in that container, right? So if I do a docker run name random, right? If I'm doing an nginx here, and this is gonna run in the background, and then I do a docker exec. Actually, let me do it again. Let's do Alpine, because that should have the command I need. And then if I do a docker exec, on the random container, and then I'm doing, this is going to be in Alpine, so I need to use ash, and then I did an ls there, right? If I see that. Now, if I do, so what you're going to see here is this is a list of the processes now running in the command, and this is the original, this is the container running, the nginx process, and then I'm coming in as a different process under exec. So what would happen here is if this is the theory. What might happen here is if this shell is sort of messing up, either there's something wrong with your connection to the container, because if you have sort of some sort of weird hiccup between you and the container talking, then maybe this will just go dark and it won't be able to talk, or maybe something wrong with the GUI or terminal GUI that you're using or the shell you're using. So the first thing I would do is I would back up and use, if you're on Docker for Windows, I would use just a pure plain PowerShell terminal, right? So that way I'm not using any sort of third-party things like maybe Commander or utilities like that, or the Bash shell that you're sort of, if you're that kind of person that uses the Ubuntu that comes with Windows that has the Bash shell, and you're sort of getting into Docker that way through a loopback connection. If you were doing that, I would back up and just go plain straight up PowerShell, because just to weed out any potential issues there. The next thing that could be happening here is that this shell is just not working. So you could try then just opening up another shell window and doing that same docker exec. Now, if you get in with that exec and it works, then you know that it's just something wrong with that connection. And that could be everything from a firewall or security program on your computer to some weird setting on group policies in corporate environments. Like back in the day when I would run group policies, they would cause a bunch of, when it would actually do an update on the computer, it would do random things that would break certain apps on the computer. I've not seen that on Docker, but it's always possible. So at least if you're going to be troubleshooting, I would do that. I would try to get into it from another shell, doing a docker exec, see if it's still responsive, see if it's still working, and then you'll know whether or not it's the container that's freezing or it's just your shell connection that's freezing. That's the first step that you really need to figure out. And then maybe that'll help you troubleshoot. And of course, you can go look in Event Viewer for the Docker logs and see if there's any information in Event Viewer about what's going on with Docker. Maybe it's getting some sort of error on the system. That's the best I got for you. Hopefully that helps. Oh, yeah, I see you're saying now. Anyway, if it just wait, it eventually comes back, container stays up. So yeah, I would assume that there's something fundamental on your OS that's doing something funky. I would try it with other try it with other non-node apps and see if you exhibit the same issues with other non-node containers to see if it's just a Docker-wide thing, or is it the specific container, or is it the whole system? Yeah, that's the kind of thing I would have to troubleshoot. But I've never seen it before, and I've never had anyone tell me that. So you're definitely the first. I don't know if that's good news. That's probably not good news. It'd be great if you could just Google it and there would be the answer right there at the top of Google. So good luck with that one. All right, next question. Yes, and yeah, definitely look up the WinPTY in case although that tends to exhibit issues right away, and you'll kind of tend to know if you have issues with WinPity. Not sure, I've never heard anyone say that in public, so, but definitely Google that with Docker run if you have certain issues. Great suggestion, thank you. Thank you, Syntax. All right, so Derek has a question. Best way to debug networking issues with Swarm overlay when the DNS resolver is not behaving as is. Let's see if you have any more info on this. Nope, I don't see anything else. Okay, so a couple of things to start out. The way that DNS works in Swarm with the default overlay networking is that it's running essentially a DNS daemon that's namespaced to each container. So each container is getting different resolution, right? They're getting different names. So that it's not using the local host file anymore. That was something we actually used way back years ago with Docker 1.9, I think, or 1.8, long time ago, 4 or 5 years ago at this point probably. And so what you're really talking about is this DNS server, right? So you can always do some troubleshooting with NSLookup, dig, and other utilities. Throw those in your containers. Let me go to my browser and give you. You may know already some of this stuff, so I'm just going to tell you that. Anyway, NetShoot is a general network troubleshooting utility for Swarm and Kubernetes, and it's essentially just a container with a bunch of Linux tools in it. So you can get that. I'm going to post this in chat, so you can get that one. Thanks, Ray. And so the thing I do here is the first thing you want to make sure is that your containers aren't caching DNS resolution. So this is a quirk in certain setups. I'm trying to think out how to explain this. So let's say you're running a Node app or a Python app or something, and that app is doing DNS lookups in the app to find another thing. And I don't have this figured out for every language and every framework, but there is some issues with those applications and the way they look up DNS and that whether or not they cache answers. So one of the challenges sometimes people have is they spin up their Node app, then later they spin up a new app while the Node app is still running. And I'm just picking Node. I'm picking on Node, but I don't know that Node has this issue. I'm just using it as an example. And that app may not see that new DNS entry because maybe it queried it before the container started up, and Swarm won't answer for a DNS entry until the service is created, right? Like it doesn't know about a thing before there's a thing. So what happens is the app can cache those results, sometimes minutes or even longer, and it won't see it won't re-look up the DNS entry. And ideally, in a world where we're dealing with containers and things are spinning up and down all the time, ideally our apps are just not caching. Like they just ask for every, or if there are caching, it's only for 5 or 10 seconds, something really, really, really short. So what's interesting is most of us have never had to worry about that because things were very persistent in the old days. They were slow to update. We just worked on regular TTLs for DNS. We didn't have to sweat it so much. But nowadays, when we're really talking about subs, sometimes even sub-second, but often sub-minute or sub-hour updates to things where DNS IPs are changing, DNS names are showing up that didn't previously show up. So that's step one, is to make sure your app's not caching the stuff. That's why you want to use tools like NSLookup and dig to figure out, is it Swarm or is it my app that's having these problems with finding the DNS? The next step is that the way the DNS gets updated in Swarm is through the control plane, and that control plane is the control plane is really running something called a gossip network. And what that means is that these different nodes can update each other. They don't all have to wait on the official. They're not necessarily all to one endpoint, like the manager that's active inside of the Swarm cluster. So at least that's the way I understand it. So this gossip network doesn't. So that's a firewall issue. And if you have certain ports open, the data plane, which is where your containers are all talking, will work. But if the control planes ports are not completely open between all nodes, and they will have little intermittent issues like this where they cannot get the latest DNS updates for their own engine, because essentially each engine on each node has its own, is responding to the DNS queries. It's not like when you do a DNS query in a container that it's going to the Swarm manager to get the answer. It's doing that in the local engine on that host. So there's probably some tools in NetShoot, and I actually make my own version of NetShoot. Let me go back here. I make my own version of this, and because I'm not sure if he actually has dig. No, he doesn't have dig in there. And I actually make my own, which probably needs to be a little updated. I forked his, and I have my own NetShoot, and I think in mine, no, I don't have dig in there either. What did I add? I think I added in Vim. Oh, you know what? It's not going to be, some of these are going to be under different tool names underneath here. Well, crap. I don't remember what I added. I could probably look at blame and see what I did there. But anyway, I forked this. So you might want to fork the NetShoot, add the utilities you need. That's my point I'm trying to make, is you can make your own NetShoot with your own tools. And he has so many tools in there that I couldn't possibly use them all. But let me back up here. So, for instance, he's showing off Linux. This is Linux performance stuff, not so much related to networking. But he has started to put stuff in here for networking, because on the Kubernetes side, networking is starting to get more and more complicated as we start dealing with different networking plugins, service mesh, stuff like that that's affecting all the networks. So I would spend some time into this. So essentially checking firewall ports, and you can do that. I'm just going to search for it because I'm pretty sure I'll get it right on the second link. So I have a page here. If you're using Swarm, just make sure that you're opening up all these ports, and I even have it in an AWS-friendly format. And you need to have all these ports open on all the nodes, right? So I actually break it out into managers and workers. So I would, step one, see whether or not it's your app or it's Swarm itself. Step two, look at the daemon logs of all the machines to see if they're getting any errors about communicating with each other. Step three, make sure that all these firewall ports are open. And step four would mean you have to start diving in deep to, is it all nodes? Is it just sometimes? And essentially turning on the -d in Docker daemon to do debugging, and then looking at debugging logs. That's a whole nother area of troubleshooting that I won't unfortunately be able to do today. But that's the level you're going to have to go to. So I would do all these easy things first before I started looking at things like Docker daemon debug logs. The nice thing about Swarm is that because it's built in, a lot of it's, the logging and troubleshooting of it is really just troubleshooting Docker. Really what you're trying to figure out is, why does this engine that I'm on not resolve that DNS if that's in fact the actual issue? And it should be getting its updates from the rest of the Swarm. Why is it not getting those gossip network things? There's actually a troubleshooting tool. Let me see if I can just Google for it and find it. Docker Swarm. Oh. So there's a couple of things. Troubleshooting methodology. I'll throw this one in here. This is an article from Docker on troubleshooting Swarm. It may have some insight for you, but what I was looking for, I think it's actually a tool that's been put into something else, but let me see if I can find it. Swarm. I keep so many bookmarks. Ooh, here we go. This is the one I was looking for. Mark Church. Yeah, page moved. Yeah, it's over in lib network now. That's right. All right. So I'm going to give you this one, and this one gets a little hot. This one gets a little in depth, but essentially it's an interesting deep level troubleshooting tool for swarm networking, and yeah, that's going to get you. Once you start diving into that stuff, you start to become a swarm networking expert. But this is a potential tool that you can use. This one of the tools that the Docker team created to help them troubleshoot things going on. So that hopefully plus the swarm troubleshooting methodology page on the success site will get you farther down the road. That's all the info I have on that. So great question. Diving deep into that answer. Good times. All right. Let me scroll back up and let's see what the next question is going to be. Jim asked a question. Sounds like it's security related. How would you recommend knowing who is downloading and installing your images? Any way of tracking the users without making the image private? No. I'm assuming you're talking about Docker Hub, and as far as I know, they do not provide those logs, probably for privacy concerns, because since it is a public resource, you would not want to be able to see every IP on the internet. You would not want to have others know that you're downloading an image from Docker Hub necessarily from which IPs. So if you ran your own registry, you could probably just, if the Docker distribution, which is the repo that runs Docker's open source registry, if that doesn't do it out of the box, which I'm thinking it might, but it's not going to be a default option, you could always put a proxy in front of it and have all those logs dumped out and then see that. But yeah, there's no way to do that. Sorry, Jim. And I think that's actually something that the captains have asked, and Docker's basically said back to us, no, we don't provide those logs. Kind of like the same way you don't know who's downloading your repo on open source from GitHub, right? Let's see. Yeah. And a lot of these questions you're getting answered, but I'm going to answer them anyway. So thanks so much for the help in the chat. Andy asked, do you have any advice on mounting the same persistent volume using Registry across multiple containers in a swarm stack when the PD can only be attached to one node at a time? Yeah, so you cannot. See, here's the thing about container orchestration, Andy, is that containers don't change any of the fundamental underlying storage infrastructure features or limitations. So what I mean by that is if you're using Elastic Block Storage in AWS, which can only talk to one container, one server at a time, right? You can only connect EBS to a single EC2 node at a time. That's a feature or a limitation of that storage device, that storage system. Containers don't change that. And I don't know that they ever would, right? Certainly they don't today. And all the tools out there will just assist you in getting that EBS object onto the right node for the right container at the right time. Now, on AWS, if you use something like Alexandra mentions NFS, that's essentially what is backing the EFS tool with AWS's EFS storage. And that is slower, but a type of storage that is designed for multi-node, multi-read and write. It's essentially like a Windows file share if you're from a Windows background. A SMB, CIFS file share in a Windows world has that same functionality where multiple end nodes or clients can connect to the storage shared over the network. iSCSI, for example, does allow it, but it tends to not allow multiple writes at the same time, only reads in certain technologies, depending on whether you're using advanced storage like NetApp, stuff like that. So when you think about storage, you basically remember that containers don't change any of the limitations of storage, really. So you have to go find the right storage. And in fact, when people ask me about storage in general, a lot of people tend to gravitate to storage, like I need the container storage tool first. To me, that's the last thing you should do. First, you look at the application, you look at its requirements. I'm running MySQL. I have to have certain response rate, a certain level of I/O. Hopefully you can find out some of these things, and then you have to go then looking for the storage itself that will fulfill that need. And then last thing is, how do I get that storage working in a orchestrator or Docker itself if you're not using orchestration, like just a Docker run? And then, so that's how, because most storage vendors now are all providing Docker drivers, Kubernetes drivers, stuff like that. So I don't tend to go looking for that first. I tend to answer the questions, what's the app need? Let me go find the right storage solution. Once I find that storage solution, how do I get it connected to my cluster? Maybe you did it that way, and maybe you're just already at the point of saying, hey, how do I do multiple read writes to it? And unfortunately, you're going to have to find specific storage that supports that. Now, we can get into that whole, storage replication, right, where you're replicating files across different servers called shared nothing storage, or where you have storage that's sitting on one node that's shared across the network, maybe using NFS to others, or you're using cloud storage or your own private storage in a data center. Those are all different types of storage solutions that you would work out before you decide what needs to be in your orchestration, right? Because again, all those things aren't necessarily container specific. They're just standard storage solutions, and most of them have existed before containers. And then you just need to get the right driver or plugin for your container orchestrator or Docker run. So hopefully that process will help you work out what you need to find to solve your problem. Yeah. Let's see. Next question. Derek says, Prometheus Alert Manager HA, 2 instances cannot ping each other. Well, ping is maybe, when you say ping, are you referring to exactly the actual ping command? And when you say instances, are you talking about containers, the host? Because I don't see how that's related to Alert Manager. And to be honest, I don't think I've run Alert Manager in high availability mode, so I'm not sure if there's something specific you're referring to on the inside. Oh, okay. So moving on from the question. Thanks, Derek. All right. So let's see. Is there a way to run container in privileged mode with Docker Swarm? I'm experiencing this particular issue while in Swarm mode on CentOS where SE Linux is enabled. Alexandra says sidecar using native Docker. So no, out of the box, if you're specifically talking about privilege mode. Now, privilege mode basically turns off all security in a container. SE Linux is not always compatible with privilege mode, and I'm not sure if that's what you're referencing here. I can't actually. Let me see if I can look up the issue. But I'm going to take this opportunity to let's see, to talk to you a little bit about different Swarm options. So, just going to take a look at your issue real quick. So this is the issue you sent me. So let's talk about, before, I'm not going to dive into that issue and specifically exactly what that's all about, but let me give you some options and then you can figure out if those are going to help. And maybe they're already listed because it looks like this is a pretty decent log. Obviously, disabling SE Linux is not what we want to do here, right? I mean, SE Linux is one of the great ways to ensure proper security on a Linux system. It's not always the easiest thing to deal with, like all things, like AppArmor, everything else that is a potential security improvement on Linux. So the last thing I want to tell you to do is go disable that. So I'm not going to tell you to do that. The goal is to see if you can get around it. Now, privilege mode, essentially, it's tough, right? Because privilege mode disables all the security. So ideally, what you're getting down to is a set of things like capabilities or different security options that you can enable in your container when it's run, so that you don't have to run privilege mode. Because privilege mode is like the nuke option. It disables everything, and it's usually what you use as a last resort plan because you can't figure out what the security thing that's limiting your container. And there's lots of things in containers that you can do to control containers. Because when containers run by default, there's certain things that automatically get applied, like an app armor profile, like certain capabilities are removed from it talking to the Linux kernel. So it's probably one of those things that's part of the problem. It might be SE Linux itself, which you can configure. So let's talk about Swarm. Swarm, let's see, Docker, CE. So if you didn't know, you can get the release notes of each Docker release over on Docker Hub. And here in we're about to release 1902, and one of the things in Swarm that's coming out, a new feature for this version, is some security features. So one of them is adding support for syscontrol options in services. So now I don't know what you're trying to run with Portainer and what the specific issue is in Portainer, but if it's related to something that you can do by opening up syscontrol options, now in Swarm you can do that. So over time, in fact, there's a list. I'm going to post the releases up while I'm here, and then I'm going to give you this list. All right, so there's this huge, long-standing, like 3+ year old issue on GitHub. Yeah, and what it is it's comparing all the features of Docker Run to Swarm, and essentially as the Docker team adds functionality to Swarm for a particular feature, it's checking off the things on this list, because Docker Run had tons of features, and when Swarm was released, they weren't going to be able to replicate every single one of those options for Docker Run into Swarm. And some of them don't even make sense to run in Swarm. So like IT, right? That makes no sense in Swarm because it's a declarative model. It's not running you can't run interactive on something that may be running on a different node, at least not yet. So I'm going to put this one in here as well for you, this URL, in case you want to go down this list and look at some of the other options, and maybe those will help you debug the security issue. The last thing, which I would do before I just gave up on it and like disabled SE Linux, because I wouldn't want you to want to have to do that, is try in my dog versus cat repo. And if you haven't heard me say this before, the dog versus cat repo is essentially a place on Docker Hub, or on GitHub, sorry. And I'll put that up there. This is a bunch of my Swarm examples. And one of the examples I have in here is how to run a Docker run nested in a Swarm service. So it's not technically a container running in a container. It's a container running that then sends a command to the local Docker engine to start up a container. And it seems a little convoluted, but it's a great way to get around the limitations of Swarm, and it works fine. There's not a whole lot of issues with doing it this way. And let me see if I can show you an example. So here is a service that I have in a compose file, and in here I'm essentially installing a plugin, right? So I'm telling it to run the Swarm exec image, which has Docker installed and allows me to run a command one time against the host. And it's running, this is how I connect the socket from the host into that Swarm service. And then I have it just running a Docker command against the host, whichever host it's going to run on, right? Now, this is so that I can do plugins across the entire Swarm. So if you ever needed like a storage driver and you needed to run it on all the nodes across your Swarm, or even just a certain set of nodes, you can use deploy options down here to constrain it and actually prevent it from running on all nodes if you want. But I have it running in global mode, which means it'll do this on every single node in the cluster, and it will do the Docker plugin install for the particular plugin I need. The other example I have here is for the prune command. So a lot of people ask, hey, how does Swarm can auto clean up images on its own? And it doesn't, but there's a great way to do this yourself. And this is a closer example to maybe what you want to do. And that is I'm running the standard Docker image, which means I'm going to be running a Docker command inside a container in Swarm. And I'm running this on every node. And then I'm connecting the Docker socket, which means it will talk to the engine on the host that it's running on. And then it's going to run a shell command that essentially waits a day, runs Docker image prune, and then waits another day and then runs again. So it's always running, but it's mostly in a wait state inside a sleep state technically inside of a Docker container. It's doing nothing until it needs to run that command. So in this way, you could change this, and your command would be the Docker run command -- privileged for whatever container you need to run. Now, this still, as long as you start to behave a little differently, where you make sure that your container properly shuts down when it's supposed to, this will work. And it's not a horrible solution. I think it's a better solution than disabling SE Linux because it doesn't lower your security. But honestly, at the end of the day, I would try to get rid of the -- privilege. I would try to see what it is about this container that it needs on the host, and I would go looking for that option in Docker run, because the privilege mode really just turns everything off. So I'm always trying to figure out how to not use that. But great question. I'm glad we talked about it. All right, let's see if we got any more good questions. All right, I got a question. I cannot apply UFW rules on Docker containers. Yes, you cannot. Inside a container, I'm not sure what your goal is there. Maybe I would need more information to help you solve your problem. I'm not sure what the problem is. You just can't really do that. There's not a firewall running in containers. What you can look at is if you need to somehow limit container access inside maybe the Docker networks, is you need to look at other networking plugins that would potentially provide features at that level. And Docker has a list of plugins on Docker Hub, and you can go look for networking plugins and sort of investigate which ones would help you do what you want to do. I don't recommend you apply UFW rules any firewall rules at the host level, because that gets really complicated. Essentially, in my mind, if I need some sort of protection from my swarm from the outside, I'm going to apply those at the network level, like security groups in AWS, for example. If I'm doing it inside of the standard Docker tooling, like in a swarm with overlay networking or in a Docker server with a bridge networking, I would use the standard networking scope, and I wouldn't need firewall rules because I would be creating different networks and only have the containers on the networks with the other containers that they need to talk to and that they trust, right? So you would use the different networking parts, like you would create a bunch of different networks essentially, and you would use those as sort of VLANs to protect rather than specific firewall ports. If you're trying to protect things on the host from the outside client connections, I would probably, the way in the cloud at least, is you put something in front of that, like a security group or some sort of networking firewall that the cloud vendor provides you. If you want to do that yourself, you can try doing it on the host with the published ports and controlling that, but you're going to be running into IP table rules because Docker runs the IP table stuff, so you're going to need to read up on that and figure out if UFW doesn't conflict with IP tables and stuff like that. So it's a little dicey there, and I generally don't recommend doing stuff at the container level for firewalling unless you're going to get a specific networking driver that supports that. Hopefully that helps without much more of your information. And you responded, I see here, I want my server firewall rules to be applied on Docker containers. Yeah, so I don't know how you would do that. Sorry. I've not seen anyone do that that way, right? They use something else to control ingress and egress, like a Docker networking plugin or an external firewall outside the swarm. So then when you're looking at networking topologies and networking drivers for Kubernetes and Swarm, you see that that's where you really should be doing this stuff, not necessarily at like the host level. You should be controlling it inside the orchestrator, ideally, or outside with some sort of firewall like a security group. Next question. When would your K8s course on Udemy come out? I'm feeling like it's this year, but I have no more specific information because if I tell somebody a date, it's always wrong. And I don't really like pressuring myself with arbitrary dates to deliver something that I don't know how I'm going to deliver it, because quite frankly, we're in the middle of recording the course now. And I will say that what you're going to see if you're already in Docker Mastery is you will get some Kubernetes videos soon. inside of Docker Mastery before we release the full Kubernetes course. So essentially, my goal is in Docker Mastery, you'll get enough Kubernetes to get you started, kind of like you do with Swarm, but to do a full treatment on how do you build Kubernetes from the ground up, how do you deal with all the different security and networking things, that's really going to take a long course to do, right? So we're doing that. We actually have most of that content already created, but I don't have a delivery date on when we're going to finish recording or anything like that. So first, what you're going to see is inside of Docker Mastery, you'll see some new videos, and some of those are already recorded. We're still recording more. And that's going to basically get you started with Kubernetes. Basically, I think around the level that you would expect to do Swarm in Docker Mastery, where you know how to deploy an app, you understand the basic topologies, you understand the terminology, you know some basics around getting the app on a network, maybe understanding a few concepts like health checks and stuff like that, right? Doing updates, that thing. And then for the rest of it, it's going to be a separate course, Kubernetes Mastery. And that'll come out later this year. So thanks for the question, and I'm glad you're excited because I can't wait to show it to you. All right. We're going to ask a few more questions because we're at an hour, and I'm so glad that everyone had great questions this week. You never fail to deliver great questions on the YouTube Live, but let's see if we can get through the rest of them. Persistent volumes across multiple containers in Swarm at Azure use CloudStore plugin, uses Azure files. Yes. The CloudStore plugin will work. I'm not exactly sure the future of the CloudStore plugin, how long Docker is going to support it. I'm trying to get more information out of them about their plans for it because it's not open source. They do provide it as a part of their Azure and AWS templates, but at this point, I would probably try to use Registry if using Swarm versus the CloudStore plugin. Not because it doesn't work now, but because I don't know when and if they're going to get rid. They're not really being very clear about the future of that plugin. And what we really want them to do is just open source it so we can all see what's going on and work on the bugs and the issues with it. But so far, that's not happened. But yes, you can definitely do that. SMB, Azure has a solution. AWS has a solution. DigitalOcean does not yet. DigitalOcean only has block storage that works on one node at a time. So thanks for that info. Appreciate it. Mainly wanted to force containers to attach to the same node. Everything I found points to kube pods. Okay, so Andy, by the way, Swarm, if you want to force containers to attach to the same node, you can do that with Swarm constraints. So if you look at my Swarm Mastery course, I go through all the various ways that you control container placement. And of course, if you're using something like Registry will just find out where the container is and it'll attach the storage to it. The only reason you need multi-node storage, like EFS or Azure's SMB, is when you literally need multiple containers on different hosts to write to the exact same folder at the same time, or read from the same folder at the same time. And there are also file replication options that you can look at, Portworx, Ceph, Gluster. There's other tools out there that will allow you to replicate files across different nodes if you're really just talking about, for example, a static website or maybe a blog where a WordPress engine where you have different static files like images or downloads that you just really need to be available on every node that's hosting the website. You can do that with file replication without needing a special storage solution that is multi-node. All right, so there's other ways to do that, and I could probably make a very short course, like 2 or 3 hours, on all those different storage options. But again, a lot of that really comes down. Those are all almost nothing to do with containers. Those are all just standard storage solutions out there. But regardless of whether you use Swarm or Kubernetes, you can control exactly where your containers go. The one thing that, like you're saying, everything I found points to kube pods. So the one thing that kube pods has that Swarm doesn't have is that a pod is a layer of abstraction that allows 2 different containers to always be together on the same nodes. And Swarm doesn't have a way to guarantee that. The way that you would do that in Swarm is, if you remember earlier, I talked about nested Docker run commands. You could technically do that with Swarm, where you're running containers inside a service and you would run multiple containers that way. And there's actually a tool out there. and I haven't run it. Certainly not run it in production yet. But it's called Swarm Pod Like, I think. Let me look this up, see if I can. Yeah, Pod Like. Let me show you this tool. It's an interesting, people love Swarm enough that sometimes it's tough because let's say you deployed Swarm and then you find this one limitation that Kubernetes solves pretty easily, but Swarm doesn't. And it's always tough because it's like, do I want to throw out my whole cluster for this one reason, right? There's something called, Victor's actually got this great blog on a lot of Swarm stuff. So I'm going to put this in chat for you. Podlike is essentially him creating a little add-on or a container essentially in Swarm that emulates the pod behavior of ensuring that two containers are always running on the same node. And the reason that you'd want to do this is just like you're talking about. If you take EBS block storage or something like that and you connect it to a node, you could technically have two different containers on that node talking to that, and you could guarantee that those two containers are on that node. Right now, Swarm doesn't really have that concept. You can't ensure that two containers are always together on the same physical node. It's funny, the old Swarm Classic that we had before Swarm mode, this is back pre-2016, it could actually do that. You could create a constraint that said only run on a node with this other container. And it was a neat way to get around this limitation and to have pod-like information or configuration. Anyway, he has this thing called Podlike. I highly recommend checking it out if you think that that's a real need. I would say it's something that you definitely want to test and experiment with. It depends on what your level of production needs to really be, because obviously this isn't a company creating a tool but it's a pretty simple tool. It doesn't do a lot. It essentially allows you to run multiple containers inside of a service, and I would check it out. It's pretty cool. Hopefully that'll help you. I want my server firewall rules to be applied. Docker. Yeah. You answered that. Sorry. Yeah, soon. Basically, I need to just make a page on my blog that says soon, and it's listing the things that I'm working on, and there's no dates, because I've kind of learned that one of the keys to happiness when you're a creator, right, when you create things for a living, is to not run under arbitrary deadlines. And we've all had these IT projects with arbitrary deadlines that someone made up, and they were all running around with their heads cut off like chickens trying to figure out how to make this thing meet that deadline, when the deadline wasn't really a real thing, right? It could move. Suddenly the date moves because we didn't meet the deadline. And that's what I mean by arbitrary deadlines. It's something you set that can be moved. Most deadlines in life are movable. So I tend to just work as hard as I can, as fast as the team can work with me on something, and also have a normal life and be sane. And that means that usually things unfortunately take longer than they do. And so I hate to disappoint people and give people dates and then disappoint them, so I just don't. I definitely feel like this year is the year. The goal is sometime this year. It's probably going to be fall for the full Kubernetes course. But if you're on the Northern Hemisphere, the Kube sections of Docker Mastery will be out this summer because we're almost halfway through them. So that is sooner than the Kubernetes. All right, let's do the last couple of questions here. Load balancer for Swarm, I would say, I'm assuming you're referring to external load balancer for the nodes themselves. If you're just talking about containers and needing to do things inside of Swarm, Swarm already has the built-in round-robin load balancer. If you're talking about proxies, I would say Traffic is definitely my favorite right now, and you probably have found that or Googled that on the internet. And if you're talking about external load balancers, it doesn't matter because it's not related to Swarm. ELBs or ALBs on AWS work just as fine as Nginx proxy solution or whatever. So I don't have. I would need more information on your requirements to really give you a specific tool. Let's see. Is there any well-known way to containerize a legacy VM-based monolithic app and make it cloud native? And how do you redirect the incoming consumer request from the VM to those containers? So this is a very loaded question, and I'm going to make this the last question. So because everyone else is talking about questions, and I'm running out of time. So This is a long topic, and it's a great topic. Basically, what you're asking here is, let me read the question again. Is there any well-known way to containerize a legacy VM based on monolithic applications and make it cloud native? And how do you redirect the incoming consumer requests from VMs to those containers? So that is two separate questions. I'm going to answer the first one first. To containerize a legacy VM, Docker provides, if you're an enterprise customer, they provide a certain level of tools depending on what the app is. And it's very framework specific because, obviously a Python app has certain requirements, certain dependencies. You cannot containerize a full VM. That's not a thing because a VM includes the kernel and the kernel drivers and all sorts of things that don't go in containers. So you wouldn't want to containerize the rest of the OS anyway, because that's probably at least a gig of unnecessary stuff inside that VM, right? If it's a Windows machine, it's probably 10 gig of unnecessary stuff. So you wouldn't want to do that either. But it's not that hard to containerize a legacy app because surely somewhere you have some written documentation or even just screenshots of how you installed that. And as long as you have that basic information, you can recreate that in a Docker file. And really, a Docker file is just like an automated way of installing something on Linux or Windows. And so if you have those instructions, you can do that. And there are tools that they kind of sell them with Docker Enterprise. You can basically go back to DockerCon 2018 in San Francisco from a year ago. You can look that up on YouTube. And they demo some of these tools in their keynote speech where they talk about taking legacy web apps mostly, especially on Windows side, because those can be like .NET framework apps and stuff like that, and then finding all of the parts and pieces to them based on their own package files that come with those apps, right? A lot of these apps have their own package installation tooling, and they look at those files and then find all the right pieces and put it in. But I don't know of a tool that I would recommend that is going to just look at the entire operating system and then suck it all in into one container. So I would say look at the information on how that app is installed, or even just basically, if you don't even have that, just start looking at, just start trying with a Docker file, and you could work on it and iterate to get to the point that you actually have it working in the container. Now, if you're dealing with the data, moving the data around is a separate conversation. You got to get that data into a volume first, and so that's going to be a separate process. I would first focus on getting the app working. Then I would worry as a sort of a sub-project on how to move the data over if that's indeed a problem where you have unique data inside that old VM. And then thirdly, how do you redirect the incoming consumer requests from the VM to those containers? That is going to be completely dependent upon your infrastructure, and that is really not a whole lot to do with containers. That has to do with, is this a web request? Is there a front-end proxy in front of it, like an Elastic Load Balancer or a application load balancer or your own third-party F5 proxy? Is it not a web app? If it's not a web app, then you've got to look at how those connections come in, because Docker is not going to do that for you. Docker doesn't do connection redirect from an old VM. That's not a thing that containers or container orchestration solves that I've ever seen, at least. So that's really three parts of a major project. And so when you hire a consultant to help you migrate, this is kind of what I do, migrate old applications into containers, Docker has an entire part of their company dedicated to this. They call it the MTA program, Migrating Traditional Apps. And they basically send out Tiger teams to companies for a fee, and they'll spend a week on site, I think it is, and they'll take your app, migrate it, learn everything about it, help you essentially migrate it into a container or copy it into a container, get it running, get the data moved over, and then swap the connections. In your case, if you don't have any sort of front-end load balancing, you've got to have basically you've got to have that app running in the container and then figure out a downtime, it could be just minutes, where you're going to redirect the DNS traffic or whatever you need to get that flipped over. And that has nothing to do with containers and everything to do with just routing and DNS and networking. Basically the same process you would do for moving from an old VM to a new VM when you have to replace VMs over time. But that's the Cliff Notes on essentially what it's like to be a Docker consultant, because you're always migrating old apps into new stuff for other people and helping them do that. And with that, I'm going to cut off the questions. I appreciate everyone so much for giving great questions this week. I feel like definitely a couple of these are going to end up in the podcast. So if you have not listened to my podcast and you have a long commute, or maybe you just want to listen to some more Docker stuff while you're mowing the lawn or walking the dog, check out my podcast at brettfisher.com/podcast. It's essentially the Cliff Notes, best parts of these live shows going back through the beginning of this year. And eventually it's going to have a whole lot of stuff that will maybe turn into something else, right? So check back next week, the same time here on YouTube. I will be here on Thursday, 1 p.m., and I'll see you next week on the internet. Thank you so much. Ciao.